So the government got concerned because the parliamentarians did not obtain the necessary clearance from the Speaker of the National Assembly as is required by procedure.
As you are fully aware, our area and region has been riddled with a lot of insecurity over the past few months, particularly for issues emanating from Al-Shabaab. We thought it wise as leadership to provide direction so that we can be able to curb this menace.
Our message was very clear to President Farmajo that Kenya has been a true friend of Somalia over the years. We hosted refugees, we hosted the communities, and we have asked him in person, especially on the borders along our counties, Gedo region and these other areas, that it is unmanned, and there are communities also who live in those areas. So we are appealing to him to help us those issues.
All right, we appreciate the latest input by Speaker Justin Muturi on that particular note, where he said that was not a parliamentary delegation. But let's just continue with the discussion and even take it a scope wider. John Gashia, who's a foreign affairs expert, is joining us by way of phone. Gashia, very good evening to you, and thank you for your input on the big story. Now, we're looking at relations between two countries that are not doing so good. We have military intervention as Kenya in Somalia since 2011. Your input on this particular issue. AMISOM troops, have they overstayed their visit? Is about time we pull the plug.
Thank you very much. The relationships between Kenya and Somalia have been what would call on and off, and there is a long historical perspective and background to that. But perhaps they have, in many, many years, perhaps in the last 2 decades, they haven't been as difficult and as challenged as they are currently. And this has more to do with, of course, most recent political developments within Somalia itself, and perhaps more recently resource mobilization and also larger political, internal political dispensation, both within Somalia and also within Kenya. And perhaps then this, builds on that long hate-love relationship, for lack of a better word, that Kenya and Somalia have had a very checkered, relationship. At times it's been open hostility, at times it's been Cold War, and at times it's been in between open hostility and Cold War. And we are in this particular stage now, and the likelihood that this could escalate and deteriorate is quite high currently, and this has more to do with internal political developments within Somalia, and this has more to do with the relationship between the federal government in Mogadishu and the regional governments, specifically with Jubbaland and Gedo region. Perhaps also it's in lieu of the anticipated withdrawal, so to speak, or the end of the mission of AMISOM troops in Somalia and post the AMISOM troops. Has Kenya in any ways managed to contain, to gain or project its best interest in the current situation in Somalia? I think the answer is yes for the time being, but Kenya and specifically Nairobi has to be more, shall I say, proactive and engaged in trying to create and delineate a very clear line in its relationship with Somalia.
All right, John Gashi, briefly before I let you go, the ruling by ICJ has been delayed to June 2020. This is in regards to the maritime dispute, but the stakes are clearly quite high, and we have certain external factors, the Europeans and the Gulf nations also taking sides on this. A political solution might be the best option out of this, because it might take compromise from both sides, something that the courts do not. Why do you think this has never happened as of yet?
There are so vested interests, and there are both long-term and short-term strategic and military interests, and more specifically to do with the larger hydrocarbon potential, specifically oil and its exploitation, and indeed the auctioning, so to speak, of the oil blocks within the region. But that being the case, this just adds up on a historically, difficult relationship. Even prior to this hydrocarbon, oil, and maritime dispute, the relationship between Kenya and Somalia were never, and have never been, at the best of times on an even keel. Now it is more complicated and more difficult with the internal power contestation between the regional government and the federal government in Somalia, and its fear that regional countries, specifically Kenya and to a large extent Ethiopia, have sought to engage what would call peripheral players in trying to contain a more assertive Somalia. And then on the international level, then we have the hydrocarbon, the mineral, and the sea issues coming into play.
Well, thank you so much, John Gashi. We truly appreciate your input right here on the big story, foreign affairs expert. And let's just pick it up from where he's left. Abdi Rashid, thank you for your patience and staying with us. The maritime dispute, what do you make of this? Because we have the ruling set for June 2020, but some time has been given for more negotiations between the two neighboring countries. What do you make of all this?
I think the crisis we see in Gedo and the escalation in relations between Kenya and Somalia, to a large extent, I think also, are driven by, I think, are basically driven by political, I think, motives to try to maneuver or modify or actually get the outcome which both countries expect. Now, for Farmajo, I think clearly the intent to basically assert himself and appear as a strong leader, so that eventually when this victory comes from ICJ, which many Somalis are hoping for, he then can take claim and credit for what he has achieved. He has, taken control of the regions. He's won the maritime dispute case, and all that because he wants to become the next president of Somalia. He wants to win another term. So all these, I think, escalation plays very well from where he sits.
All right.
Now, from the Kenyan perspective, I think things are much more difficult. Kenya, I think, desperately wanted negotiations, and I think you remember that very unusual trip which President Kenyatta made to visit President Farmajo in his own hotel room, which was a breach of protocol in many ways, but I think symptomatic nonetheless of Kenya's, I think, clear intent to find some kind of, ways to de-escalate the crisis.
Okay.
Now, these two countries, I think, eventually must find ways to sit down and negotiate, because this is not just a legal problem. As some of our earlier speakers have said, this is a much more complicated, complex relationship. And just this maritime dispute can actually be a trigger for a much more serious confrontation between the two countries.
All right. All right, now we'll definitely get back to you. Let's just bring in Ali Roba, the governor from Mandera County, who's joining us by way of phone. Governor, good evening, and we appreciate your input. Just give us a state of the situation as it is right now on the ground. Earlier on, you had asked county government employees to stay away from their offices over security fears. What's the state as we speak?
The state, thank you very much. The state is, it has remained extremely tensed because the security forces within our border from the Jubbaland security still in Mandera, and as well as the the federal government security forces are in Bulhawa. After yesterday's clash, it's pretty unpredictable and remains unstable, and that is why we've advised the county staff so that they do not fall inadvertently into problem to stay in their homes, because yesterday we got almost 12 injuries from stray bullets in town as a result of that clash.
Right, as we appreciate the tensions are still high. Being a neighboring county, how does Mandera exactly relate with Somalia? What are the pros and cons?
We relate to Somalia fairly well. You cannot choose your neighbors. Unfortunately, before the advent of devolution and before resources started coming to our region, the only government that was known to the population of Mandera in terms of dependence, in terms of cheap goods and that, before the fall of Siad Barre, the county was highly dependent on Somalia. But after the fall of Siad Barre, of course, the security situation came in. The population had their own fair challenges of looking at all their problems as coming from Somalia. But after the advent of devolution, we tried to stabilize our own system. But nevertheless, the challenges of insecurity remain in Somalia. But we, to the best of our effort as a county, because we can't choose our neighbors, we've tried to do our best to give them the best support that we can as neighbors and try to live together in order to make sure that we look at this and are optimistic that someday they will stabilize and our relationship will come back to normal. But it hasn't been easy owing to the fact that all our insecurity problems are spillover from Somalia.
Speaking of insecurity problems and the spillover due to the porous borders, do you think enough is being done in order to ensure the safety of Kenyans and Mandera citizens as well?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The leadership of Mandera have shared their grave concerns with foreign forces that are present in Mandera. Our system have continued denying that they are present. And the worst thing is that when the system denies the presence of foreign forces that the public can see, public trust gets eroded completely, because the public are looking at their own government lying to them that these people are not within our border. And they have the enforcement have, been coming to Mandera through Mandera County using the main roads, at some point escorted by our own security forces. And that has created a major challenge for us. And from the government perspective, it is important that we allow Somalia to solve their problems in their own ways and make sure that we don't put our own public in harm's way by allowing foreign forces to operate within the county. And Mandera knows too well, because in the past we've had Ethiopia and Somalia clash over Mandera, both of them attacking, and at that small triangular level, many inadvertent casualties and property losses have occurred during the time of several phases of organizations that have taken control of Somali affairs after the fall of Siad Barre have also created a lot of harm for the population. So as far as we are concerned, not only enough has not been done, but there has not been listening ear in terms of the problems that the public were facing, and the government has not responded, let alone engaging the leadership in dealing with the challenge.
Okay, many thanks, Governor Ali Roba, right there, joining us by way of phone, just giving us a state of affairs as it is on the ground. Mandera County tensions are still high. Let's cross over to Abdi Rashid. Your final comments. Governor has just spoken about the disassociation of, communication between the national government and the county government in Mandera. When we have such a case and Kenyan lives are at stake, how should we proceed exactly?
No, I think the governor has made some very valid points, and I think the government ought to be listening to the sentiment of leaders from northern Kenya as well as the population. I think clearly the more Kenya gets drawn and gets sucked into the political crisis in Somalia, the more that will also play in northern Kenya. I think one factor which we haven't alluded to, which we haven't talked much about in this interview, is definitely the growing resurgence of Al-Shabaab and how Al-Shabaab actually has escalated attacks in northern Kenya. So the people of northern Kenya feel pressure from all sides. A government that is not necessarily very sensitive to their sentiment and views, Al-Shabaab which is merciless and kills them, and also a Somali government which also tends to divide them. So they are basically caught between a rock and a hard place. And I think the government ought to be sensitive to some of these concerns. And I think going forward, it will be best if the leaders from northern Kenya can come together and engage, Nairobi systematically, so that there is actually a way out of not just the educational problem, but the security crisis and also the mess in Jubbaland. Because I think Kenya ultimately has to begin to disengage from Somalia.
All right.
Because that is compounding also our own internal security problems.
Definitely. Many thanks, Abdi Rashid. Your input has definitely been appreciated on the show. Horn of Africa analyst, also allow me to appreciate John Gashia, who joined us by way of phone, as well as Governor Ali Roba, just giving us a state of affairs as it is on the ground. Our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, earlier on had a conversation with Abdi Kadir Mohammed, the former Mandera Member of Parliament. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for watching The Big Story. We'll definitely continue focusing on the state of affairs in Northeastern. Do enjoy the rest of your viewing. Good evening.
This is KTN News.